Good afternoon. Welcome to our event on Russia's response to the financial crisis. I'm Thomas Carruthers, Vice President for Studies here at the Endowment and the moderator of today's session. Of course, here in Washington, we've been, as always, so self-preoccupied in the last year or two with our own financial problems. Europe quite caught up in its as well. I think probably insufficient attention has been paid here in Washington to the question of Russia's own experience with the global financial crisis, both how it hit Russia and how Russia has responded to that. But it's of significant importance both to the Russian economy, to the region around it, and I would say to the global economic system as well. So we're going to explore that today with three people who are extremely knowledgeable about these questions, and it's really a privilege to be able to bring all three together. We're going to start with a presentation by Pekka Sutela. He is Principal Advisor at the Bank of Finland on monetary policy and research, and I'm happy to say he's just joined the Carnegie Endowment based in Helsinki as a non-resident senior associate in our Russia and Eurasia program. So it's a pleasure. I think this is your first time speaking at Carnegie now that you have an affiliation with us, so it's delighted to have you here. We'll hear next some comments on his presentation and some, of course, thoughts of his own from Anders Ausland. It's always a special pleasure to welcome Anders back because he served here and well for a long time at Carnegie and the Russia program, including as its director. He's now a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute here in Washington and a well-known expert on the economy of Russia as well as surrounding countries. And last but not least, Zeljko Bogatic, who is the lead economist at the World Bank on Russia. He's been based for the last 2.5 years in Moscow. He's recently relocated to Washington, but still fulfilling the role of lead economist for Russia at the World Bank. So he brings significant on-the-ground expertise and practical expertise as well. So it's a great panel. We're going to proceed. I think, we're in the hands of economists, so we're going to be having some PowerPoint. But I trust the screen is visible for all of you, and we'll proceed from there. And then, of course, after the three presentations, we'll have discussion. Pekka?
Thank you. If you wish, I'm ready to throw up the PowerPoints, but after all, these good people here have been taking the burden of putting them on the computer. Perhaps I should fulfill their obligations and follow to a degree at least the PowerPoint. It's indeed a pleasure to be here for the first time as an affiliate of the Carnegie Endowment, but I've been preparing for this for quite some time, having followed Russia for any number of decades. What I'm going to say today concerns the response of Russia to the financial crisis, or to the crisis that started as a financial crisis and then became a more serious kind of crisis. I'm also going to say a few words about what I think the Russians think that they have learned from the crisis and about what the crisis means for their possibilities for pursuing policies in the future, and also on what their approach to pursuing policies after the crisis will be different from the approach that they had before the crisis. And actually what I'm going to be one of the things that I'm going to be arguing is that many of the challenges that they will be facing after the crisis are very similar, if not the same, that they were facing a few years before the crisis, but that the framework and perhaps the thinking has been changing in many respects because of the crisis. When talking of the arrival of the crisis to Russia, the thing that we always remember is the Russian leaders saying that Russia would be a safe haven, which would be basically outside of the crisis. Yes, they did say that. But so did leaders in many other countries, including the key European countries. And my argument is that actually they were not unprepared for the coming of the crisis. They did not know when exactly and in which form the crisis would be coming. But as you all know, they always had a fundamental distrust in the way in which the world economy has been construed and in the way it has been managed. with, as they think, too small a role for themselves. They had been accumulating reserve funds starting from about 2003, 2004. They had been debating about what the role of these reserves funds would be, what the desired size of them would be, how they should be invested. And fortunately for them, they were never able to come up with the decision to invest them, and therefore the funds were easily available when the crisis in the end hit. Also, already by the in the mid of the previous decade, they had been thinking about what the world would be like, or what Russia would be like in the future, where they could no longer be dependent on hydrocarbons to the same degree as they had been depending on them beforehand. They did trust that the export price of hydrocarbons would remain high, but they also expected, as they expect at the moment, that they will not be capable of increasing the production of hydrocarbons to a notable degree, and therefore, if and when the rest of the economy would be growing, in particular, they would be facing the issue of how to shift an increasing share of tax burden from the extracting sectors of the economy somewhere elsewhere. And obviously, they were always knew that while export of hydrocarbons are the key to their export revenue and to public sector revenue, their role, when narrowly defined in providing employment, was very limited and remains very limited. They had a very major growth boom, as we know. The growth boom was based on high export prices. It was also based on the ample liquidity of the international financial markets, which was also available for the Russians. And Russian entities in about 2006 to first half of 2008 were able to borrow for a real interest rate that was negative. And these two things obviously were not self-evidently sustainable in the future, and the leaders were warned about this fact by their leading advisors. And as I said, certainly the preparation started in 2006 for the 2020 economic program was all about the future, where the role of resource sectors would be much less than it had been before. And certainly, when we think that first they were in the denial, and then suddenly the notice that the crisis was there in the end of 2008, I think the view that they were in complete denial does not go very well with the fact that their policy measures, when adopted in the autumn of 2008, did not particularly look improvised in a hurry. So they did know, or they did expect, that some kind of a crisis might be coming. The key problems had been identified. They had the resources to do something, and they were not completely unprepared or what would be taking place. So why did they have all this talk about the safe haven? Well, first of all, because the leaders of any nation are not in the business of trying to create panic among the population or in the marketplace. They wanted to shift the blame for the global economy, or what was coming a global economic crisis, to where they thought that the blame was. Therefore, they would be saying that we had nothing to do with this. We thought that this would not be a problem for us. It was other people's problem. And certainly, as long as it seemed that this would be a purely financial crisis, there were good actual reasons to think that Russia would be not particularly severely hit by the crisis. A country with a small financial sector, country with little foreign debt, country where the households didn't have financial wealth, and therefore collapse of the stock exchanges would not have a major wealth impact on household consumption. They had all these kinds of arguments in their favor. But the thing changed when the financial crisis changed into a crisis of the real world economy, when not only their possibilities of, when not only their export prices collapsed, but also when many of the export volumes collapsed, and what many people neglected to note before the crisis, when it was found out to which a high degree the Russian financial system was dependent on foreign funding, including for maintaining the interbank market. And I suppose overall, one of the reasons why in the global economy we tended to underestimate the decline in production that was forthcoming was the fact that we did not quite understand that the financial crisis might have very serious consequences for the interbank markets, for the functioning of the payment system. And then when we noticed that the impact on the real economy globally would be less than what we thought it might be, perhaps in the beginning we had not appreciated sufficiently the capacity and the willingness of the finance ministries and of the central banks to pump liquidity into the markets. That's a policy that did not succeed fully anywhere. It did not succeed fully Russia as well, but at least we were, as a finance ministry, central banking community, we were better prepared than we perhaps thought originally, than that we were prepared. We had also learned something, and that had an impact on the behavior on the Russians, or the Russians as well. So why was the drop in GDP in Russia so steep? As steep, actually, almost exactly as it was in my own country, Finland. And naturally, Russia started from a higher growth rate than we did, though we started from a relatively high growth rate as well. The standard explanations, in particular, if you look at the Russian discussion on these issues, I think leave a lot unexplained. Obviously, the bad institutions in place in Russia have been faulted, but then some of the countries in the world with some of the best institutions, like Germany or my country, have suffered from the crisis almost as much in terms of shrinkage of GDP as Russia has done. Russia, the second explanation routinely offered in Russia is excessive dependence on resource sector and the exports of hydrocarbons. True enough, but then on the other hand, on the average, resource-dependent countries seem to suffer less from this crisis than the rest of the countries, partially because many of them, like Russia, had accumulated the handy reserves funds for this kind of rainy day, and when rain came almost like to Tennessee a couple of days ago, these reserves were very handy in case as well. One has to remember that for a country on its income level, trade-wise, Russia is exceptionally dependent on the international, on exports, more so than, for instance, China, not to mention the rest of the large emerging economies, some of which remained very close to the international economy and therefore were not hit by this crisis, in fact, at all. And for a resource-dependent country, Russia has an exceptionally large population. So the task of maintaining domestic demand and employment in Russia looks somewhat different from what it looks in a country like Norway, Kuwait, or Qatar, which are very trade-dependent, extremely resource-dependent, but at the same time have a small population whose welfare is much easier to attend to than is the case in Russia. And certainly the fact that Russia has many kinds of dual things. One of the dual things that Russia has is a dual financial system, where many of the key companies, enterprises in the country have outsourced their financial services to our markets, which then proved to be rather less than reliable, while the population, if it is dependent on financial system at all, and most of the households don't even have a banking account, is dependent on small domestic, short-term financial market where long-term funding is hardly available, partially because of the failures in structural reform policies earlier on. And as the IMF has been recently arguing, those countries that have been dependent on foreign funding have been hit by this crisis much more severely than those countries where the financial system may have been owned by the foreigners, but where domestic sources of funding still have been important. The Latin American country being an example of the latter one, what used to be called the Eastern European countries, and Russia being examples of countries where the financial system, even for interbank markets, was dependent for foreign funding. In Russian foreign interbank markets before the crisis, in something like 60% of trading, there was a foreign counterpart. And when the wave of finance turned away from Russia, Russia was particularly badly hit because of this simple fact. Actually, as a central banker and as a Western European central banker, I have to agree with those who say that basically the Russian policy response to the crisis was adequate. The simple reason for that is that the response was very similar to what we have seen in the other countries in the world, and therefore, obviously, we tend to think that when people do same kind of things that we have been doing, we tend to think that they have been basically doing the right kinds of things. And obviously, the IMF, the World Bank, and others are bound to agree. There have been debate on how large the policy package in Russia was compared with other countries. Comparing apples and pears here doesn't make much sense. It doesn't make too much sense to try to calculate the size of policy packages. Russia obviously had its peculiarities. Some of them were connected with the starting point, started with a very high, or with a high inflation, therefore willing to avoid a stagflation. They couldn't really decrease nominal interest rates very fast. They made some peculiar policy decisions, like the stepwise devaluation at the turn of 2008 and 2009, which everybody thought would fail in a grandiose way, but in the end did not do that. And even the costs of that policy were less than what we sometimes think. There were other things where Russia's response was peculiar, both because of the starting conditions and because of some policy choices that were made. Perhaps, goodness gracious, this contains about half of my slides. So, as I said, I'm ready to continue without the slides, and that is what I'm going to do. No, that's the end. Okay. That's, by the way, there must be something wrong about our system, because that's not even the first time it happens within the week. Anyway, so as I said, trying to recollect my thoughts, Russia was not as completely unprepared for the crisis as we have thought. The policies, or many of us have thought, the policies pursued were basically adequate, even in cases where the policies were different from what others have been done. They did not fail in any grandiose way. And it seems to be that the crisis which came to Russia via the collapse of export prices, decline in export volumes, and the turning away of the financial flows is now going away from Russia because of the same reasons. The oil prices are high. They are expected to remain robust in the future. I don't have any particular wisdom about how high they will be, but we don't seem to have any reason to expect anything like a collapse. Financial flows, given the fact that the world is very full of liquidity indeed, are looking for homes for themselves, and Russia is in the similar position as some other major emerging economies, where the risks they are facing is an excessive appreciation of the currency, and they have been thinking about policies to counteract that. Therefore, the current Bank of Finland forecast, which is also the European Central Bank of forecast for the Russian economy for this year, foresees a growth rate of 5.5%, and we expect then the growth to settle down to what we, in the medium term, to what we regard as the current potential growth rate of Russia of about 4% annually in the medium and perhaps even in the long term, as people have here at the Endowment have been argued. And actually we think that as far as the Russian domestic economy is concerned, the risks are upside, not downside. One of the reasons being that the household incomes have been maintained during the crisis, households are not indebted, and there is still a lot of further growth or consumption to go forward in the Russian economy. We also believe that some kind of investment, particularly residential construction, will start to grow relatively fast during latter half of this year. And therefore, assuming that there is not a major problem in the world economy, we expect the recovery of Russia in these terms from the crisis to be much faster than the recovery of many other countries, including mine. In a way, one can argue that this is one of these examples of a good crisis that was lost, in the sense that in the end, in spite of the steep decline of production in Russia, this will prove probably a short-term crisis, and therefore the pressure for structural reform in Russia will be modest in the medium term to mid-term. The basic financial policy conservative stand has been vindicated, and the Russians will try to return again to the accumulation of reserve funds as fast as possible. The problem, however, is, and this is one of the major new challenges, that the fiscal situation is changing, at least if we do not expect a new ballooning of the international energy prices. This is changing because gas and oil production in Russia will not be growing fast. The relative size of the energy sector will be decreasing, assuming that the rest of the or large parts of the rest of the economy will keep growing in the future, and therefore the fiscal revenue cannot be dependent on the energy sector to the same degree that it has been dependent in the past. At the same time, a major part of the fiscal decisions to increase pensions, salaries, some subsidies into the economy are going to prove very difficult to turn back, and therefore Russia will face severe problems in balancing its budget, not to mention to coming into a surplus that will facilitate the accumulation of reserve funds in the future. This happens at the same time as you know, the age structure of the Russian population will be worsening from the point of view of labor markets. There will be less flexibility, presumably, in the labor markets because of the young cohorts will be much smaller than they used to be, and the relation between non-working and working population will be getting more problematic. One way of looking at this is to look at the fate of what were the national priority programs that were passed for Russia in 2006 to 2007 in health, education, housing, and agriculture. Some analysts have argued that Russia was then entering an era of oil-led social policy, a completely new setup for domestic policies in Russia. But actually, if you look at the structure of budget implementation in Russia during the last 3 or 4 years, what you notice is that there was hardly any increase in the share of expenditure for these branches, though there was an increase in the absolute amounts. And since 2008, then the expenditure for the national economy, as it is put in the budget reports, increased fast, and many of these social policy-oriented expenditures, their share in the budget was cut. And indeed, 2 weeks ago, Putin, in a speech, said that Russia now has to establish new policy programs for the very same branches, activities that they established the programs 4 years ago. And it remains to be seen whether these are going to be the same kind of, or same programs, or different kinds of programs as they were several years ago. So what we see, and here I only concentrate for the economy or the time purpose on the fiscal situation, what we see is an attempt to come back to surpluses and reserve accumulation at the same time when the balance is being squeezed both from the revenue side and from the expenditure side. And this is going to be one of the routes via which politics will re-enter Russia in the years to come, because contrary to what was the case previously, it will no longer be just a matter of dividing additions to resources in the economy and the society, but there have to be true priorities set between competing aims, and this will be one of the routes via which politics will be returning to Russia. I end here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pekka. All right, we'll turn next to Anders Osland. Anders?
Yeah, I don't know if my PowerPoint presentation is here, so I'll try to get into it. Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again, and particularly with my old friend Pekka. I don't remember how long we go back, but I fear since the early 1970s.
Must be something like that.
Yeah.
We were both in the kindergarten at the time. Anders was in Stockholm and I was in Helsinki, but somehow we met anyway.
Yeah. And I think that this is quite an important theme. I will focus more upon the structural factors, less on the fiscal, and I will focus more upon where Russia is going right now. And when discussing Russia, first we of course need to look upon the economic strengths. What Russia accomplished in the years 1999 to 2007 was extraordinary. In 9 years in current dollars, the Russian GDP increased 9 times. then you get a sense of hubris, from $200 billion in 1999 to $1.8 trillion in 2008. And that provides much of a backdrop of why the Russians really felt that they were invincible. And they had persistent budget surpluses and huge current account surpluses, leading to the accumulation of the third largest reserves in the world after Japan and China. And then let us look upon the causes of high growth. I think that this is a major problem in Russia. If you ask Russians, why has Russia grown so much, you will get the one-word answer, Putin. And if you ask for a two-word answer, you get political stability. These are, and possibly added then oil. So what were the causes of growth? The causes of growth were the market reforms that were essentially carried out 91 to 93 by Gaidar, and then 98 to 2002 by a variety of people because of the financial crisis, which forced Russia to complete it. And then, of course, after a big fall, you have a large underutilized capacity that turned out to be more valuable than many thought. And then finally, we have high oil prices. So what was the contribution of Putin in this? Hardly any. He pursued the reforms 2000 to 2002. And of political stability, none. And of course, energy is very important in the Russian economy. And this is just to give you the sense of how important it is. It's about 2/3 of Russia's exports, 50% of state revenues, but only 20% of GDP properly counted. So Russia is highly dependent on energy, but it's not an extreme petrostate as so many other countries are. And indeed, here we have an energy curse, which is really the question today. Can Russia overcome its energy curse? And you can say that the Russian intellectuals are divided into two groups, one who think that it's possible and one who think that it's not. And the problem with the energy curse is, of course, corruption. And if you have a lot of corruption, you need to be authoritarian because otherwise you are caught out. And the state that you get in that case is dysfunctional. And here I picked corruption from the, Russia is on 146th place according to Transparency International's assessment of corruption in 180 countries. And you can see here, the red line is Russia, the yellow is Ukraine. Ukraine used to be much more corrupt than Russia until the Yukos affair in Russia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And the lower you are here, the more corrupt you are. So since 2005, Russia has beaten Ukraine by being more corrupt. But last year, Ukraine caught up again and managed to become as corrupt as Russia. This is a shame. And here you have the other authoritarianism. I'm using Freedom House line. Ukraine swung up with the Orange Revolution to become just about free, according to Freedom House's ranking, while Russia fell below the line of not free at about the same time. Indeed, after the Yukos affair, which I think was very much a dividing line for Russia's development. And the most striking thing is that corruption is just out of control. Only Equatorial Guinea is richer in per capita terms than Russia and more corrupt. This is not a category in which a proud historical nation like Russia wants to be. And my best illustration of this is that Russia is so corrupt that it has failed to build roads since 2000. Oop, here you can't see it. Sorry, it doesn't come through. But the point is that the road network has stayed at this level. It's no more roads. This is 97, and this is 2008. And there's been no extension of the road network. And then we come to the crisis. The crisis shocked the Russians because they thought they were invincible. They thought that we get 7% growth each year, whatever we do. It doesn't matter that kickbacks on state procurement is 50%. Everything here just goes forward. But then GDP fell by 7.9% in GDP, the biggest decline among the G20. And in particular, if you compare with the BRICS, where what the Russians normally do, this is embarrassing. And this year, as Pekka said, we'll see a growth rate in the order of 5-6%. It's always difficult to predict in an upswing, or in a recovery, because the growth is easily much larger than anticipated. But 5.5%, as Pekka said, sounds good to me. But what is happening then with the state revenues? They fell by 4.7% of GDP from 2007 and 2009. And public expenditures have increased. It's not catching up. Industrial production tumbled by 11% in 2009. And we are now seeing that industrial production has recovered. And this is not the big concern. And if we look upon the new economic reality, this is not bad. The budget deficit ended up 6% of GDP last year. It will be slightly better this year. This is better than in most other places. And Russia still has the third largest international reserves. The exchange rate has bottomed out and stabilized. And I had breakfast with Minister of Finance Alexei Kudrin last week. His biggest concern is that Russia will be flooded with capital inflows now. So he was very upset about the very low interest rate in the United States, which means that there is a big carry trade of cheap money from the US to nice places where you can get a better return for the money, like Russia. It's a common BRIC concern. And the oil price has now risen from $34 per barrel to $85. And you can say that Russia, in that regard, is back. The great improvement is that inflation has fallen to its lowest ever in the post-Soviet period, 6.5% in March. So there is a lot of good news, but the shock remains. And the discussion that has developed now, it's very interesting to listen to President Medvedev's speeches today. They consist of three parts. The first part is devastating, a criticism of how bad things are, and he's particularly attacking state corporations, which are black holes in the economy, corruption, and the very corrupt police. And then he comes to a second part of his speeches, where he offers tiny proposals what to change. And then you get the third part, that's the utopian future, where everything has become as well as it just could for no apparent reason. So the question is, what do you make of his speeches? Some people emphasize that he doesn't come up with any viable proposals. I think it's more important that he comes up with very hard criticism of the current state of affairs. This is very much like Glasnost in 87, 88, when Martin Walker and I lived in Moscow and enjoyed reading Novi Mir each month. But what we are seeing is only a beginning of a debate. So I think it's too early to see where it is going. But we can see what the focal problems are. I should add here that the only reform that is actually going on in Russia now worth mentioning is the military reform. Russia is now pursuing the most radical military reform that has happened since the Crimean War in the 1860s. And just one number here. We have a new book coming out in a month's time, the Russia after the global economic crisis. And, well, I should mention Samuel Charap here is one of the co-authors in this edited volume. And we have one striking chapter on the Russian military reform in it. The number of tanks in Russia is being reduced from 22,000 to 2,000. So this is a truly radical reform, but it's only happening in one sphere, and for the rest, very little is happening. And we are then seeing these big state corporations being black holes, most of them, most of all, perhaps Gazprom, which is in a profound structural crisis. At the same time, Russians talk about them as octopuses that are sucking in one enterprise after the other. And the conclusion here about the past is that Putin had luck, but has done little for Russia. And we are now seeing a severe economic mismanagement. And for the future, status quo is not an option. Russia is at crossroads. And one alternative is more authoritarianism and state capitalism and protectionism. I would call this Putin scenario. That is the inertia scenario in the Russia 2020 strategy. And the alternative is what's called the innovation scenario in the Russia 2020 with economic liberalization and hopefully also political liberalization, which could lead to 6.5% growth. And this is a very clear division. And it's not a problem in the short term. It's a problem in the medium term. Right now, Russia is not threatened by any crisis worth mentioning, but something needs to be done if Russia is to move forward. I could add here that what is currently being done, for example, is massive increases of pensions, because Putin is afraid of the pensioners. He had promised to increase pensions before the crisis this year, and he did so, although it adds 1.5% of GDP to the deficit. And typically we had First Deputy Prime Minister Igor Shuvalov speaking here in Washington in September. And then he said that it's good with crisis because it makes it possible for us to reform. And now I saw him in February in Moscow. And then he said, well, of course we couldn't do any reform last year because of a crisis. And there is a strong sense of malaise. So what could happen if we would see a bit move forward? Renewed liberal economic reforms, I think, are perfectly possible. We haven't seen this lively economic debate in Russia since the early 2000s. You can say that the debate ended with the arrest of Khodorkovsky in October 2003. And now there is a strong sense that this nationalization policy must end. At the same time, at the state corporations, which are run by and large by Putin's KGB friends, are trying to take over more enterprises. The state while Medvedev is campaigning all the time on reform of the state corporations, something that there is a broad understanding of is that there must be a renewed deregulation in Russia. Something must be done about the red tape. And there's also a sense of that the domestic repression should be eased. Medvedev has here repeatedly sacked a large number of Minister of Interior officials, but nothing has really improved as yet. The one international question that is important here is Russia's accession to the WTO. As you might have noticed, exactly 1 week ago, here in Washington, we had all the 3 top Russian people for WTO accession, Shovalov, Kudrin, and Minister of Economy Nabiulina, who met with their American counterparts. I don't think that we have seen that level of meeting about WTO before, if ever, without the president. So both the American and the Russian side are now making a major effort to break the roadblocks so that this can happen. And I think that this could be very important for the domestic and economic developments in Russia, because this kind of a malaise normally means that something is likely to happen, but it's not obvious. Thank you.
Anders, thank you very much. Very to the point and thought-provoking as always. Next, we'll hear from Jeliko Bogatic. Would you like to move over there by the computer? Yeah, Anders, would you mind switching place?
Sure, sure.
Oh, no, actually.
I can move.
Oh, she'll do it this way. Okay, thanks.
Mobile communications. So how do we do this?
Great. Thank you very, very much. Delighted to be here for the second time in a while. I've been living in Moscow for the past 2.5 years or so, and have kind of had a chance to be a first-hand witness, if you like, an economist witness of this very tumultuous period in Russian economic history, and trying to make sense of it all through the lenses of a macroeconomist. So what I'm going to give you is a bit of our current perspective of our economic policy team working on Russia, based on our latest Russian economic report, which we just completed in April. By the way, most of what we have to say, and also in retrospect, is all on that website that is indicated here on the first page of my presentation. Lots of detail, more than you ever wanted to know about the macroeconomics of Russia. But what I'd like to kind of say is very much kind of complementing what my colleagues have emphasized, and much of this kind of corroborates the broad picture, the sense of where Russia is and where it's going, the underlying causes of the economic crisis and the depth, and the short-term and medium-term prospects. So this is perhaps just another economist perspective with some additional vignettes, if you like. So first of all, I'd like to walk you through our view of Russia's and the world's nascent economic recovery that we see now evolving, and then talk a little bit about economic and social outlook for Russia in this and next year, kind of a short-term recovery outlook. Then we'll also speculate about some of the lessons in terms of what we have actually learned from this crisis as macroeconomists, and some lessons that might be relevant not just for Russia but also for other resource-rich economies, and perhaps even for developed countries, given fundamental similarities with which this crisis has affected both developed and developing countries. And finally, I will speculate a little bit about the prospects for reform and long-term growth. So here's kind of a very brief scorecard of Russia's scorecard during this Great Recession. As Anders put it succinctly, Russia was doing well before the crisis, and growth was in excess of probably a long-term potential at a time when the crisis hit. Industrial growth was also high before the crisis, then it slowed towards the end. Unemployment was fairly low. This is end of period numbers, so it looks a little higher healthy federal fiscal surplus of 4%, no public debt, sovereign public debt to speak of. I mean, Russia is still a super credit-worthy country in terms of the debt levels. Inflation in low double digits and poverty levels of about 12%, perhaps high for a higher middle-income country, but still much lower than 10 years earlier, and hefty real wage growth and massive international reserves. If you look at all these figures in 2009, the two figures, negative figures, stand out, and that's the collapse in output and industrial growth, -8 and -11%. And that's really where the hit was, as was explained. I'm not going to dwell on much on that. I think Pekka and others have amply explained the underlying forces behind this. I would just mention that manufacturing was particularly hard hit in Russia, and I think that is one of the construction, retail, finance, many of these kind of interest rate and finance sensitive sectors were the hardest hit. And I think part of the reason was, as they emphasized, the essentially drying up of liquidity and the capital flows, but also a sheer collapse of global demand on which Russia as an open economy was very much relying. What's interesting in this scorecard is how few large negatives we see in this in the second column. I mean, basically, Russia has muddled through this very tough recession better than initially feared on a number of scores. I mean, unemployment went up, but it didn't go up too high, especially compared to our initial expectations. The fiscal balance actually better than originally feared, about 6%, and it's coming down now on the heels of high oil prices, but also a credible fiscal adjustment plan. Public debt, sovereign public debt, is not going to go up by much. So in that sense, Russia remains very creditworthy. Inflation is actually going down, kind of a sweet spot as a result of the aggregate demand weaknesses. And poverty has increased, but not actually as much as we feared, and in large part because of large increases in minimum wages, pensions, and public sector wages, which Russia short-term could have afforded given its fiscal buffers and the large fiscal reserves that was willing to spend during the crisis. Even real wage growth was moderated by this large fiscal stimulus, mostly on the current expenditure side. And in the end of the day, despite the fears of currency crisis, systemic banking crisis, and the loss of international reserves, Russia is still sitting on very large reserves after having lost indeed some couple of $100 billion, which were probably kind of excess reserves to begin with. That helped it smooth out the transition from an essentially appreciated to more balanced exchange rate level. So that's a kind of a very telegraphic view of the crisis. Now the global economy is recovering, led by industrial production. As you can see here, all the regions are recovering of the world, including China, including Russia. And the growth is very much globally driven by emerging countries, East Asia in particular, and China, again, accelerating after the big slowdown. You can see that the global growth momentum is very much reflected by the rebound of external trade. Trade was the first to go down. Trade is the first to come back. Capital flows are also surging this year, boosted by a surge in bond issuance, especially in Asia and in Latin America, but also in Eastern Europe. Russia has just floated a very successful and a low-cost international bond of about $5.5 billion. Essentially, the countries are exploiting this very kind of a sweet spot of low sovereign spreads. And you can see that Russia is in the company of Brazil and Hungary and Turkey, having historically fairly low sovereign spreads right now. So many indicators, therefore, are suggesting that the global recovery is gathering steam across all components of demand, sectors of the economy, regions of the world, indeed, although some regions are growing faster than others, with East Asia, as I mentioned, being the leader. Oil market fundamentals are reflecting this recovery, and so this is the World Bank's official current forecast of the oil prices in 2010 and 2011, $76, $77 per barrel. Now, actually, this has just been revised upward to 80 and 78, but basically you're looking at moderate price recovery and the stability of oil prices, but way below the earlier levels seen before the crisis. Nevertheless, at the global level, there are major policy challenges, remaining uncertainties in terms of how the developed countries are going to unwind this huge fiscal stimulus and risks associated with that for economic recovery, and also the debt risks, as we have seen playing out very dramatically in the case of Greece, and perhaps also some other economies on the margin of European Eurozone. Tightening of financial conditions is probably inevitable over time because the crisis is likely to result in a higher cost of credit longer term compared to before the crisis. The easy money era is going to stop at some point, even though understandably leading central banks of the world are still somewhat reluctant to start aggressively tightening monetary conditions. There is still a risk of protectionism, and that is perhaps one of the big policy challenges facing all countries. Russia's nascent recovery is underway, and you can see here it is led by actually domestic demand, consumption, that is recovering faster than the other components. Industrial production lagging behind, but there's now some new data showing that the industrial production is picking up. Employment, you can see kind of almost flat, and poverty increased, but then is likely to actually remain flat and probably come down. In terms of the labor market, what we have seen is a kind of interesting development that in the initial stage of the crisis, unemployment went up very, very quickly as the flexible part of the labor force was released. But then as the crisis, there was kind of a sense of a light at the end of the tunnel in early 2009. Firms started hoarding labor and employing more part-time employment and involuntary vacations as temporary adjustment. I think behind this is also perhaps a skills shortage, in some of the segments of Russia's labor market and the economy, and some of the firms realizing that once the demand returns, they better have those skills to respond to that demand. So, and it's kind of an interesting dynamics that the net result of which is that the unemployment went up by less than feared in the beginning of the crisis, especially given the force of the output collapse. Employment nevertheless remains high, over close to 9% now actually, and it is concentrated among the young males in cities, somewhat reflecting the kind of sectors that were hit hardest: urban sectors, finance, construction, retail, and manufacturing. The recession also seems to have been a bit of a equalizer in terms of the impact on various income groups. But this is, I think, partly also a result of massive fiscal stimulus concentrated actually on the middle class as opposed to just the poor. So simply put, the incomes of the poor suffered less than the incomes of the middle class and the higher segments of the population. More flexible exchange rate on the monetary policy side, we have seen that is a welcome development, and they've engineered this in a quite unorthodox fashion, like kind of a gradual depreciation and a willing loss of international reserves, and as a result, they were able to restore the confidence in the banking system fairly quickly. But as everywhere, there is a problem that this easing of monetary conditions did not result in significant new lending. And this is a conundrum all countries are facing. We do see, however, in the latest data that there's some credit beginning to flow to the economy, and households in particular, some mortgages are coming on stream at a cost which is much more acceptable than before. Banks are now also targeting customers to buy new cars. So I think that you do see a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel. On the fiscal policy side, you can see that 2009 was clearly a difficult year, and I think the number in these kinds of economies you want to focus on is the lowest item, non-oil fiscal balance. That's the relevant one for oil-rich countries, and this is actually showing a very large non-oil deficit of over 13% of GDP, and this is worrisome for the longer-term sustainability. What is the long-term sustainable level of this deficit? We have recently calculated in a study that it comes to about 4.5%, maybe 5%, depends on the assumptions. So this gives you a bit of a sense, the magnitude of required fiscal adjustment over the next several years. Now, not all of this is going to come from expenditure cuts some of that is going to come from revenue. So it makes it ambitious, but feasible. But still, there's a significant fiscal adjustment ahead of Russia that is going to be required. This is our current official outlook for Russia that we've developed last month. We see basically output this year rebounding to the range of 5 to 5.5%, very much in line with what Pekka was reporting for the Bank of Finland. We think that fiscal deficit is going to be lower than many analysts believe on the heels of higher revenues, but also the ability of government to control expenditures and some contingencies in the budget, and the ability to actually withdraw parts of this fiscal stimulus. And current and capital account in relatively healthy territory, all assuming continued recovery of the global economy and oil prices in the range of $76, $77 a barrel. And then continue. I would mention, however, this 5.5% growth, while it looks very high, in fact, largely reflects just a statistical bounce back from a very low base. So about 4 to 4.5% essentially is a pure statistical artifact. So that additional 1% is the real kind of a growth, if you like. So once that effect is gone in 2011, we expect Russia will grow at a more kind of a steady state, if you like, 3.5% per year in the short to medium term. This is what we see based on the current data, based on the current policies and the prevailing international environment and oil prices. That are the critical variables that one has to take into account when developing outlook for a country like Russia. This is a little more nuanced picture, gives you a little bit more textured view of how the recovery is going to look like. Fully agree with Pekka that this is going to be very much driven by domestic demand, and because of the factors that he outlined, indeed, Russian households haven't actually suffered as much as feared in terms of unemployment. And at the end of the day, of course, during the crisis, of course, there was a lot of impact. But in terms of the real wage impact, it was quite modest, actually, in low single digits. Unemployment is below 10% still. Wealth impact was very limited because there was no other wealth other than wages and salaries to speak of. Russian households are still catching up in terms of basic consumption and durable goods. They're still kind of hungry for, cars and better TVs and refrigerators and things of that sort. So I think that catch-up effect is still there. And finally, they're not terribly indebted. Total household debt in Russia is about 9% of GDP. 3 to 4 times lower than in Eastern Europe. So there's a lot of potential for that household demand and consumption to catch up, provided that the credit markets begin to unfreeze. What's the problem? What's the problem with this kind of economic recovery going forward? The problem that we see is something that I think is also an issue in other CIS countries and perhaps beyond, and that is that the job growth is going to be very weak. This may be a kind of a jobless recovery. This chart shows you how before the crisis in the ECA countries, Europe and Central Asian countries, even before the crisis, when growth on average was 4, 6, 7%, the job growth was fairly weak. Most of the countries are clustering around a job growth of about 1%. Look what happened in the crisis. All countries move into the lower left negative quadrant, showing negative real output growth and negative employment growth. And now they're recovering, moving back into the first quadrant, positive growth and positive employment. However, look what does the scatter diagram look like. Essentially, the mean of employment growth is almost zero. This is basically the current forecasts of growth in ECA countries for 2010 and 2011, including Russia. And you can see that they're all recovering on the horizontal axis, represented by the GDP growth rate, but the employment growth is very weak, sluggish. This is what we call the jobless recovery. And there's a number of reasons why this may be happening. And the first one is obviously that the growth itself is too weak to absorb substantial new employment. And there may be other structural reasons associated with the structure and regulatory environment of the labor markets. But this is a concern. This is a concern for social economy, for social stability, and so on and so forth. Government interventions in Russia have helped. It was a fairly untargeted and relatively expensive fiscal stimulus that Russia implemented. About 3.5% of GDP in a pure fiscal stimulus and 3.5% roughly in financial sector support. The net effect is that the poverty increased in Russia to about 14%. And our best guess is that without that stimulus, it could have easily have gone to about 17%, with additional impact on the middle class. So they certainly cushioned that impact, and they deliberately targeted the entire middle class. They not only raised the minimum wages and unemployment benefits, but massively raised pensions and public sector wages at large, reflecting their concern with the broad social stability, and also particularly socially vulnerable monocities and regions that depend on one or a handful of industries and sectors that are of particular political and social concern for the authorities. So we could talk a lot about this fiscal stimulus. We have analyzed it to some extent, and we have something to say about that. But overall, we also come to the conclusion that it was a fairly adequate and a rapid response under very, very difficult circumstances. It could have been probably made more, with hindsight, of course, with hindsight, all the generals are smart. It is possible to envisage a more effective stimulus and more targeted and less expensive, if you like. Perhaps if it was focused more on poor households and infrastructure, critical bottlenecks in infrastructure. But this is, in a sense, the matter of nuances. So
a bit more, but you have a bit more time, but make sure you move ahead.
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm almost closing in too. So what are some of the structural issues that remain, I think, underlying this kind of Great Recession experience in Russia? Investment climate. Something obviously that was less immediately on the radar screen during the crisis because it was all focused on managing the crisis. But the most recent reports suggest that some old problems like taxes, corruption remain very high on the firm's agendas. But some new problems like infrastructure constraints and the skills are particularly emerging as worrisome constraints on private sector business and investment. And I think this is worrisome for long-term growth. Briefly, what are some of the tentative lessons that come to my mind? So this is not necessarily putting lessons in somebody else's mouth or the authorities, but I think that there are some lessons that I think many countries, including Russia, can draw. One is that the importance of prudent fiscal policy, of running fiscal surpluses during good times, accumulating fiscal reserves for a country like Russia that is very much sensitive to a high volatility of its oil prices and capital flows. Exchange rate flexibility that Russia was able to engineer during the crisis helped. Macroprudential view of the financial sector, it is something that all countries will have to take on board going forward. So macro policy must take into account asset price developments and bubbles and credit booms in the financial sector much more than in the past. Those balance sheets effect apparently are massively important. The importance of targeted social safety net and automatic stabilizers. Had Russia had better automatic stabilizers and more targeted social safety net, the discretionary part of its fiscal stimulus would have been lower, and therefore it could have been less expensive than it was. The investment climate, I think, going forward, will have to improve much more and more dramatically because country will have to compete against many other countries for a smaller pool of international and more expensive international capital. And finally, the crisis does provide an opportunity for reform of structure of Russian economy. Accelerating public sector, financial sector reform and diversification, the kind of old holy grail that Russia was never able to find in the past, and now has yet another chance after this crisis to try to find. What are the prospects for that reform? I would agree with Anders that I think the crisis has strengthened the reform wing of Russian government, led by the Ministry of Finance and Mr. Kudrin, who was very vulnerable just before the crisis, if you remember. There was a talk about his replacement. I think the crisis has vindicated both the prudence of the 10-year prudent fiscal policy and his own role as a crisis manager. And that's the good news. So I think that on the fiscal adjustment side, even though it's ambitious, I think it is feasible and it will be implemented. I'm also curious about how the trade and WTO agenda is going to evolve. And now that Russia has recognized that individual path to WTO is more appropriate, as we have also argued and advised them, that may also be an important agenda that is moving perhaps faster. Those two items. The rest, however, faces a lot of headwinds, and the rest is really a longer-term agenda. Public sector reform, including the military reform mentioned, closing infrastructure gaps, strengthening financial sector. This is a huge agenda. Consolidation, prudential regulation, supervision, disclosure of financial information, credit information. A lot of this is moving. The question is how fast and is it adequate? Social sector reform is also huge. Skills, improving skills is I think at the crux of the problem, I think, long term. Investment climate, I mentioned that, and of course the all-important but very elusive quest for diversification and innovation. That there is no really a great recipe here, but I think that all of these reforms, I think, taken together, if taken to a higher level, if you like, would bode well for Russia's greater diversification and higher quality, higher productivity growth that would be necessary. We also envisage two growth paths, the kind of a business as usual, kind of a muddled through growth paths in medium to long term of about 3 to 4%. This is quite possible for Russia. With the 0 to -1% growth of labor force and 1 to 2% capital contribution and 1 to 2% productivity contribution, Russia can easily grow 3 to 4% per year on the basis of the economy that it has already developed, and also on the basis of growing importance of domestic demand. However, Russia can and should do more if some of these longer-term structural constraints we mentioned are addressed much more forcefully. And I would single out three that have to do with capital, with labor, and with financial and credit. The quality of capital, the infrastructure, has to dramatically improve. Russia has some major infrastructure gaps in all major infrastructure sectors. It's very hard to see how it can support very dynamic growth without China is an example. What can massive infrastructure improvements can generate. Second, labor contribution to growth. It's a declining labor force environment, so the only way they can actually contribute to long-term growth is by improving the quality of that labor, its contribution. That basically boils down to skills and not just diplomas. And this is a whole new, and of course the financial sector. Russia has a very minimalist financial sector that has to develop, has to deepen to support that kind of recovery. And financial sector that, let's face it, is really kind of very much linked to the kind of the big boys of this economy and large state corporations. It has to kind of branch out and to support that small and medium-sized enterprise, the missing link in the industrial structure of Russian economy that is necessary in order for it to truly diversify and develop a much more robust and diversified economy in the long term. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let me ask the first question. Thank you very much for the presentation. Jellico, you and Anders, you said that you were sort of just adding to two presentations that you basically agreed with the thrust of. And I saw the convergence at the end in terms of your conclusion about the two scenarios of slow versus somewhat faster growth. But along the way, is it just a difference in how Anders Ausland tends to present material and how the World Bank tends to present material? But I heard a happier story from the World Bank than I heard from Anders over the last 10 years. And I'm still a bit puzzled whether is that just tone or is there something really substantive different in your view of this decade? Anders, would you like to comment on what you heard and say, is it again, just the way the World Bank has a cautiously of presenting information, or are you putting a different emphasis on certain things?
No, I think that it's very much how different people are supposed to speak. The World Bank is not supposed to use the words corruption or repression. These are no World Bank terms, but have to be deleted from the presentation. And then instead you discuss them in terms of problems with infrastructure. Well, if you have kickbacks of 50% in at least in infrastructure project, you have problems with infrastructure, and there are holes in the infrastructure that need to be filled out, but that seems to be difficult. So we are just expressing ourselves in slightly different language.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's take some questions. Yes, and if you could identify yourself, Jessica.
Excuse me, Jessica Matthews at Carnegie. I sort of want to follow up, I think, on that. There seems to me a disconnect between how well Russia did before the crisis, how quickly it's recovered, the picture you all painted of basically sound policies, and this extreme degree of corruption. How does it do so well if the corruption is so bad?
Anders, why don't you take a crack at that, but then let's turn to...
Yeah, Jessica, of course, this is paradoxical. And part of it, we have mainly here discussed fiscal policy. Fiscal policy has been perfectly well run. And that is being run by Kudrin. You can say that Putin allows Kudrin to pursue a very responsible and very highly professional fiscal policy. And then you have state corporations where you have all the big corruption. And they cost the economy a lot of money. And so far, thanks to these massive oil and gas rents, Russia had a lot of money to throw around. Now there is not this situation any longer. So Russia is now entering the distribution conflict where the state corporations are sucking out too much money. And this is very much driving the liberalism in the Russian public debate right now. So the short answer is the energy rents were so large that you could have high economic growth if you only had good fiscal policy in spite of a massive corruption in the state sector.
Any further thoughts on that, Pekka? Yeah.
Well, the first thing to say is that we don't know how much corruption there is in Russia. The best available source on that comes from the World Bank, which not only uses the word corruption, but also actually together with the European EBRD does very wide-ranging research on the extent of corruption in various countries. And the most recent estimate is that what they call the corruption tax, the share of average enterprise turnover which is used for corruption is 1.4%. That's high in international comparison. It is concentrated much more in some branches than in others. And it, for instance, compares with another source, not on Russia, but on Ukraine, where detailed micro-analysis by Garatnichenko and others comes up with the conclusion that the extent of corruption, the corruption market in Ukraine is about 1% of the GDP. But in a society which is partially based on formal institutions and partially on informal institutions, extremely difficult to define what actually constitutes corruption. What is reciprocal exchange and what is issue of clans and friendship networks and so on. So there's a lot of that we don't actually know very well in here. But may I, on another issue, this Putin-Medvedev thing, I disagree. Anders very correctly pointed out the importance of the military reform. which is based on the fact that for the first time in 500 years, or something like that, Russia is not preparing a massive land-based war on its western borders. We are pleased with that. But Mr. Medvedev would never have the capacity to pursue a reform like that. Mr. Putin has it. Unfortunately, this is a partial reform, as Anders said, and not all the conclusions are being drawn. For instance, think about the energy efficiency of Russia. What is the biggest problem? The biggest problem is that Russia inherited from the Soviet Union all kinds of heavy industries, automotive industries, aviation industries, which are to a very large degree dual use and meant for the existence of search mobilization capacity, which are no longer necessary under this current doctrine, but which can't seemingly be abolished. There's no way the car industry in a country like Russia could be abolished overnight. There is very difficult possibility of shutting down the afterwards factories, which I presume are supposed to produce huge amounts of Niva all-terrain cars in the case of mobilization, but which are no longer needed according to the current doctrine. And it should also be remembered that the work on the 2020 innovation programs, the post-hydrocarbon world for Russia, was started under Mr. Putin in 2006. That Mr. Kudrin could never have stayed before the crisis as the Minister of Finance without the support of Mr. Putin, and would not be the Minister of Finance today. That's based on their shared fiscal conservative attitude to various issues. And I do agree with those people who say that whether there will be meaningful reform in Russia after the crisis does not depend on Mr. Medvedev, because even if he knew what he wants, he will not have the credibility to implement them. If Mr. Putin knew what he wants, he would have the credibility to pursue these reforms.
Tom, can I just say to put this in context?
Just get the microphone there.
If that corruption number is anywhere near correct, in fact, even if it's double, even if it's 3%, that's a lot less than the cost of environmental degradation.
No, not really.
Go ahead. All right.
I'm not sure. Obviously, I mean, a lot of the numbers about these intangibles you have to kind of unpack and go. And as you know, the corruption is such a chimera. There's a whole slew of things, and the World Bank tried to kind of measure everything. But once you start kind of unpacking the grand aggregates into a lot of different, sometimes it's easy to get confused about the overall picture. And yes, those rankings, give you a bit of a general idea. But whether a country is ranked 86th or 130th on a list of countries in terms of aggregate corruption, I think it's fair to say that there's plenty of experiences in developing countries and development generally, that countries that actually had large levels of corruption, that actually had experienced large economic rates of growth. And for a simple reason that growth is often driven not just by the amount of rents that were extracted in a certain sectors or overall, but by oftentimes by the sheer rate of extraction of natural resources and shipments into neighboring countries, and capitalizing perhaps on existing infrastructure and skills and educated labor force, for example, that Russia had, and also the creative destruction and high productivity processes that Anders described that were taking place in the 90s and early 2000s. So I don't think it's out of international experience to have this kind of experiences. I would disagree on that the military reform is the only one that is going on in Russia, and perhaps because I've been kind of focusing a lot on fiscal reforms and public sector reforms. I think Russia was doing a lot in this area, and this fiscal prudence was not just a kind of a current narrow fiscal management of the fiscal purse. It actually is built on a continuum of over 10 years of fiscal strengthening fiscal institutions. Russia today has a modern treasury. It has a fairly good tax system, the way tax systems tend to be in developing countries. It has taken control of federal public expenditures. It bases its budget prudently on a very conservative price of oil so that it minimizes the bad surprises. It also actually is now embarking on a program of improvements of public expenditure efficiencies, which is still a little bit within the Ministry of Finance citadel. So many of this is still not perhaps out completely in the public domain. But there's a huge amount of thinking about how to improve the efficiency of both public expenditures and public sector in Russia, and military perhaps is perhaps the biggest and perhaps the most interesting geopolitically, if you like, element of that. But I think Russians are keenly interested in restructuring their economy, and I have witnessed firsthand from the ground that there's a lot of long-term thinking about where we as an economy and will likely be, and what are the sources of our vulnerabilities, the oil price, and so on and so forth, and what can we do to get there. So, and I think that's good. That kind of a longer-term perspective is quite important. If we learn one thing from this crisis everywhere is that a bit of a longer-term perspective on the parts of all the players doesn't hurt.
Can I?
No, actually, I'd like to come back. The
Okay,
audience
fine.
has been patient. We have quite a few. I'd like to take two or three. I'll come to the front in a minute. I want to get this gentleman, then I'll come down here. Yes.
I'm Bill Liefert with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Although the Russian economy did well during the 2000s, one problem it suffered from was major appreciation of the ruble in real terms, which occurred not so much because the ruble appreciated in nominal terms, but because it had higher inflation rates than most other major economies of the world. Because of that real appreciation, it was one reason why imports of consumer goods boomed, which I think is a major reason why during the 2000s there's been very little enthusiasm in most producing sectors of the economy for WTO accession. Now, if we look to the future, most macro forecasters are projecting that as Russia and the world comes out of economic crisis, world energy prices are high. Russia will probably continue to run a trade surplus. As the panel discussed, Russia probably will enjoy, or maybe not enjoy, but experience large capital inflows. That'll put appreciation pressure on the ruble in nominal terms. Looking at inflation, although Andres also mentioned inflation is down, it's still projected to be higher in Russia than in U.S., the Eurozone, other major economic parts of the world. Given all those developments, my question is, can Russia avoid the problem of a return to major appreciation of the ruble in real terms, which will continue to make the Russian economy less price competitive on the rest of the world? And if that's the case, how will Russian policymakers respond, particularly in the area of trade policy and WTO accession?
Take a couple more down here in the front, sir, and then I'll come to you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Harley Balzer from Georgetown University. Two quick footnotes and one question. None of those growth forecasts are anything like the 10% that Prime Minister Putin used to talk about. I think Russia is the only country in the world where the average cost of a bribe seems to have gone up by 50 to 100% in 2009. That could be enforcement, but it could be other things. But the question is whether in this support for social stability and the monetans, you see any evidence that if this were a double-dip recession, they would be in any better shape in a year or two than they were in 2008?
Panel, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Ed Berger, although the word diversification is used in your presentations, I heard no predictions about the issue of a higher value-added economy alongside the oil economy. What are the prospects, do you really think, for that? And
Right. Well, I'm going to return to the panel to address whichever of those three comments and questions you'd like to. Anders first, and also if you'd like to comment on the issue of public sector reform, which is...
Yeah, sure. First, on the cost of corruption, this bribe tax is only what companies pay in order to get certain services from the public sector. The big corruption lies in state procurement. And I think that 50% kickback is a standard in Russia today. So this is a totally different group of things. And then you have simply theft in state companies, which is another big category which is not included in here. And then you have coming to this question about the high prices. Russia has very poor competition because of corruption and excessive red tape. With normal competitive market prices should be much lower, and say 50% lower, perhaps it's quite possible. And that would be a result of WTO. So WTO will reduce the prices in Russia. And these assessments that David Tarr and others connected with the World Bank have done suggest that it would in the medium term give 3.3 percentage point higher growth a year if Russia joined the WTO, and very much is this because of a better functioning market. Putin and Medvedev. Well, if they say virtually have different policy lines in public on a large number of different issues, we should expect that there are differences between them. Medvedev is persistently attacking state corporations. Putin only in his latest government speech criticized state corporations at all. Medvedev persistently argues for WTO accession, while Putin tries to push it aside and pushes instead for the customs union. And Medvedev delivers far sharper attacks on corruption, while Putin is notable for never having sacked any of his associates in senior positions on corruption, which also shows that Putin cannot do a reform. He's very much a part of the corruption, and such people can never do reform. Also on foreign policy, the US government pushed very intentionally not to talk to Putin. Obama only saw Putin for a breakfast in Moscow. Otherwise, the US government talked to Medvedev because they knew that Bush had talked to Putin a lot, which each time resulted in worse US-Russia relations. And therefore, they decided that this is not a move forward, and it turned out to work. The START agreement was signed thanks to Obama not talking to Putin. That was the US tactic, and it worked. Similarly, now we had the Norwegian border settlement, which was indeed done with Medvedev. Reminds me how Sweden got a border settlement in the Baltic Sea with Gorbachev. That hadn't been possible. So I don't believe in this at all. Thank you.
Back to Angelica, and then we'll come back finally to Pekka, and then we'll end there.
At the risk of caricaturizing a little bit, I don't think that there is a risk of overheating in Russia of the kinds of, that we have seen before the crisis. I just don't see Russian economy accelerating to the kind of a lofty levels of 8% on the heels of oil prices returning to 120 or 140, and capital inflows coming back to Russia of the order of about 80 billion per year, as we've witnessed in 2007. There's just not going to be enough capital around, and Russia is not going to be relatively so attractive relative to other places to attract that kind of foreign liquidity. The global, I think, oil market is boding more for kind of a stability of oil prices in that range of $77, $80 a barrel. And also with the constraints on the financial sector, domestic financial sector, both from the supply side in terms of the non-performing loans, but also from the demand side in terms of the actual credit risk still lingering in this economy. I just don't see, those kinds of conditions coalescing again. But of course, capital account is notoriously volatile variable, so some capital can go in very quickly and can go out as well. But I think Russia now has a much better monetary exchange regime in place that is much more flexible and less predictable. It's clearly not a one-way bet for currency speculators. So the cost of large bets on Russia are very high now compared to previous crisis. All of these reasons, I think it's going to be much easier to absorb some of those potential inflows, sizable inflows of capital that I think would be more of a kind of a shorter-term nature. So it's going to be easier in a sense. That is my short answer. The good question, whether they need yet another good crisis to shake them up and to do what's needed in the monocities and restructure the economy. I don't know. It's a good question. It depends who you ask. If you asked late Prime Minister Yegor Gaidar, he would have said probably yes, that Russia might need $40 oil in order to induce the policymaker for a sizable and quantum leap on structural reforms. If you ask also respectable economists like Vladimir Mao, for example, economic historian, leading economic historian, he would probably agree with that as well. I'm not sure, myself, just as a kind of a modest macroeconomist perspective, I think that range of oil prices of about 60 to 80 might provide enough stimulus for Russian government to continue restructuring and reforming while not being in a crisis. So I think they're going to continue reforming at their own pace. That pace may not be fast enough, and it's not going to result in massive opening up, that perhaps they themselves would like to see, and some of us believe is possible. It's a different story, but also keep in mind that reforms is a cumulative thing. After a certain point, things start falling in place. So gradual reforms 10 years down the road could, lead Russia to a very different place. And place for doing business and investments than it is right now. The final point about which value-added sectors perhaps could grow, very good question. I would bet essentially on those sectors that are going to feed and meet the demand of Russian consumers and domestic demand. That means essentially consumer goods, means agro-processing industries, maybe consumer durables industries, pharmaceuticals, all the good things that consumers, regular consumer wants and needs, plus the kind of goods in terms of the quality that the Russian consumer is very much eager to own in the aftermath of the crisis. It's a huge economy, as Anders put. It's already almost a $2 trillion economy. It's the 10th largest economy in the world. Huge space for growth, both for small and medium-sized enterprises, provided they can overcome those barriers to business. So there's huge potential gains and profits to be made in this economy. And I think that those would be the good places to be, I think, if you were an entrepreneur in Russia, I would imagine. And that's also where you could add value in terms of its current relatively low-value resource base of the Russian economy.
Okay. Finally, Pekka, any closing comments in response to these questions? Yeah.
Thank you. Just two very short comments. The first one being that if indeed there will be a major inflow into Russia via the capital account in the future, there's no way Russia can prevent the real appreciation of the ruble. No way. And the second, which I think is a very fitting concluding remark, one has to remember where Russia is. Russia is squeezed between China and Finland. It will never be a low-cost production platform like China. At least it will never be a high-technology country like Finland. So what are the possibilities? The one possibility is that one is able to extract more value added from the strengths that the country has. And the major strength then is the natural resources. But talking about natural resources, in the short to medium term, there's no way Russia could earn its export revenue from sources other than extractive industries. And the capability of maintaining its export capacity in those branches must be, in a way, the number one priority of any government in the future. And this is not an issue of increasing production, because we know there are very strict limits to the possibility of increasing production. It is the possibility of increasing the difference between production and domestic consumption, also called energy and materials efficiency of the economy. And here, to maintain export capacity, Russia actually has the challenge to use not only to develop its own ways on increasing energy and materials efficiency, but also to extract the experience, technologies, and the know-how that countries like ours have had on these matters for the last very many decades. And that, I think, is another way of looking at the major challenge of Russia from the point of view of production structure in the future, and also to look at the possibilities for business between Russia and our countries and the rest of the world in the future.
Pekka, thank you. That is an excellent closing note. Well, I think we've come away much more educated about the Russian economy and both the past, the present, and the future. I want to thank Pekka and Anders and Jeliko and all of you for your attention.